Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina left her country on Monday, August 5th, amidst scenes of chaos, as weeks-long protests against her regime forced her out of power. She reached India, and it's speculated that she may ultimately travel to London, where some of her family members live. The secrecy around her movement and instances of looting at her residence in Dhaka seemed similar to what played out in Sri Lanka in 2022, and a year before that, Afghanistan President Ashraf Ghani fled as the Taliban took over. Here is a look at some of the major instances of recent political turmoil in South Asia, the circumstances, and what followed in the cases of other nations. Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina. For weeks, student protests had rocked Bangladesh. On June 5th, the High Court Division of the Supreme Court of Bangladesh ruled that 30% reservation would be restored in government jobs for the descendants of Bangladesh's freedom fighters. This led to anger among youth, given the recent economic downturn and lack of job opportunities, particularly after the COVID-19 pandemic. Even after the Appellate Division of Bangladesh's Supreme Court said the quota would be significantly reduced in July, the protests continued. With more than 300 people killed in the agitation and critical comments from Hasina about the protesters, the movement gradually became more anti-Hasina in its character. She had led the country since 2009 and was termed an authoritarian over the years for not holding free and fair elections and jailing opposition leaders. Meanwhile, Hasina blamed opposition parties like the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, the Jamaat-e-Islami, and their student groups for instigating the protesters. Ultimately, as public sentiment turned completely against her, Hasina left. The army has said it'll step in and take responsibility, but the country's future remains uncertain. Hasina may seek political asylum in Europe. Sri Lanka, Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Years of economic mismanagement culminated in a major economic crisis in 2022. It led to a foreign currency shortage, making it difficult for the Sri Lankan government to pay for the import of basic items like oil. Prices of everyday goods and food items soared, with electricity cuts for long periods. The Aragalaya, the Sinhalese word for struggle, became the name of the largely leaderless anti-government movement that emerged then. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and PM Mahinda Rajapaksa, major players in Sri Lankan politics for decades, faced calls for resignation. Protesters entered the official presidential residence, bathed in the swimming pool, and took away the president's belongings. Gotabaya left the country for Maldives and then reached Singapore. Soon after, he tendered his resignation. He also stayed in Thailand for some time before returning to Sri Lanka around 2 months later. Reuters reported then that Sri Lankan immigration officials stopped his brother and former finance minister Basil Rajapaksa from flying out. Former PM Ranil Wickremesinghe assumed power as the acting president in 2022. He would eventually be selected as the president by the Sri Lankan parliament. In 2 years, the country has attempted to strike loan deals with the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and countries like India and China. Recently, presidential elections were announced to be held in September this year. In 2023, Wickremesinghe's office issued a statement on the looting of items from the president's house. Various valuable artifacts and archaeological items went missing, including coats of arms associated with former governors and presidents of Sri Lanka. It offered an amnesty scheme for people to return the items. Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani. In 2021, the United States Army and NATO forces withdrew from Afghanistan after 2 decades of military presence, and the Taliban took over. The swiftness of the events took the world by surprise, even though the Islamist militant group had been advancing through other major cities before establishing control over Kabul on August 15th. Years of attempts to build lasting institutions for democracy and economic development had not yielded results for the Afghan government. The Taliban, meanwhile, regrouped and continued to maintain its fundamentalist ideology. As the capture of Kabul seemed complete, videos showed many citizens going past barricades at the capital's airport in desperate attempts to make it onto aeroplanes out of the country. Some even clung to the wings and tail of the aircraft and fell to their deaths. While the economic condition in Afghanistan had been difficult, the idea of a return to the previous Taliban rule between 1996 and 2001 was seen as a major step back. President Ashraf Ghani also left, and visuals showed Taliban leaders carrying weapons inside the presidential palace. Ghani was criticized for leaving Afghanistan at a crucial juncture, but has since claimed he sensed an imminent threat to his life. Later, the UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation confirmed that Ghani and his family had been welcomed on humanitarian grounds. Libya. Muammar Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi came to power in Libya in 1969 through a military coup that overthrew King Idris. Gaddafi established a regime characterized by his unique brand of socialism, which he outlined in his Green Book. Over his 4-decade rule, Gaddafi maintained tight control over the country, using oil wealth to consolidate power while suppressing dissent through brutal measures. In 2011, inspired by the Arab Spring uprisings in neighboring countries, Libyans began protesting against Gaddafi's regime. The unrest quickly escalated into a full-scale civil war as government forces cracked down violently on demonstrators. The conflict drew international attention, leading to NATO intervention authorized by the United Nations to protect civilians. As the civil war intensified, rebel forces with support from NATO airstrikes gradually gained ground. By August 2011, they'd captured the capital Tripoli, forcing Gaddafi to flee. He went into hiding, but his whereabouts were uncertain as the war continued. On October 20, 2011, Gaddafi was captured by rebel fighters in his hometown of Sirte. He was found hiding in a drainage pipe after his convoy was bombed by NATO forces. Following a brief and chaotic capture, Gaddafi was killed by the rebels, marking the end of his 42-year rule. Gaddafi's death plunged Libya into chaos, with various factions vying for control. The country has since experienced ongoing instability, with multiple governments and militias struggling for power. Despite efforts to establish a unified government, Libya remains deeply divided, facing significant challenges in its pursuit of peace and stability. Philippines. Ferdinand Marcos. Ferdinand Marcos became president of the Philippines in 1965 and was re-elected in 1969. His second term saw increasing corruption and authoritarianism. In 1972, Marcos declared martial law, citing threats of insurgency, which allowed him to rule by decree. This period was marked by suppression of political opposition, media censorship, and widespread human rights abuses. By the early 1980s, economic decline and rampant corruption fueled public discontent. The 1983 assassination of opposition leader Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr. galvanized resistance against Marcos. In February 1986, a snap election between Marcos and Aquino's widow, Corazon Cory Aquino, was marred by widespread fraud, sparking massive protests. From February 22 to 25, 1986, millions of Filipinos gathered in peaceful protests along Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, or EDSA. The movement, known as the People Power Revolution, was supported by defecting military leaders including Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile and General Fidel V. Ramos. The protests were also backed by the influential Catholic Church, led by Cardinal Jamie Sin, who called for civilian support. As pressure mounted and support dwindled, US President Ronald Reagan advised Marcos to leave the country to avoid bloodshed. On February 25, 1986, Marcos and his family were airlifted from Malacañang Palace by US helicopters to Clark Air Base, then flown to Guam and finally to Hawaii, where they lived in exile. Tunisia. Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. Zine El Abidine Ben Ali became president of Tunisia in 1987 after ousting President Habib Bourguiba in a bloodless coup. Initially, Ben Ali was seen as a reformer, but his rule soon turned authoritarian. His regime was marked by political repression, censorship, and widespread corruption. The Tunisian revolution was ignited on December 17, 2010, when Mohamed Bouazizi, a 26-year-old street vendor, self-immolated in protest against police corruption and ill treatment. Bouazizi's act of desperation resonated with many Tunisians facing similar hardships, sparking widespread demonstrations. Protests quickly spread across Tunisia, fueled by grievances over high unemployment, inflation, lack of political freedoms, and rampant corruption. The regime's heavy-handed response, including police violence and mass arrests, only intensified the public's anger. By January 2011, the protests had reached a critical mass, with thousands demanding Ben Ali's resignation. On January 14, 2011, facing mounting pressure and losing the support of his security forces, Ben Ali fled Tunisia. He sought refuge in Saudi Arabia, where he lived in exile until his death in 2019. Ben Ali's departure marked the first successful overthrow of a dictator in the Arab Spring, a series of uprisings that spread across the Arab world. Tunisia embarked on a challenging but hopeful transition to democracy. The country adopted a new constitution in 2014 and held free and fair elections. Despite ongoing economic and political challenges, Tunisia remains a rare example of a successful democratic transition in the Arab Spring. Uganda, Idi Amin. Idi Amin, originally a high-ranking officer in the Ugandan military, seized power in a military coup in January 1971, overthrowing President Milton Obote. Amin's regime quickly became notorious for its brutality, with an estimated 300,000 people killed during his 8-year rule. Amin's rule was marked by widespread human rights abuses, political repression, and economic mismanagement. He targeted ethnic and political groups, including the Akali and Lango ethnic groups, as well as perceived opponents. His expulsion of Asians from Uganda in 1972 led to economic decline, as they were the backbone of the country. In 1978, Amin attempted to annex the Kagera region of Tanzania, leading to the Uganda-Tanzania War. Tanzanian forces, along with Ugandan exiles, launched a counter-offensive that culminated in the capture of Kampala in April 1979. Facing imminent defeat, Amin fled to Libya and subsequently to Saudi Arabia, where he was granted asylum. Amin lived in exile in Saudi Arabia until his death in 2003. He never faced trial for his crimes and lived a relatively quiet life under the protection of the Saudi government. Amin's departure left Uganda in a state of turmoil, with a series of interim governments struggling to restore stability. The country faced significant challenges in rebuilding its political and economic institutions, but it gradually moved towards recovery and reconciliation. Egypt. Hosni Mubarak. In February 2011, Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt, resigned after weeks of intense protests during the Arab Spring. Mubarak, who had been in power since 1981, faced mounting pressure from widespread demonstrations driven by public frustration over corruption, high unemployment, and police brutality. The protests, which began in January, were centered in Cairo's Tahrir Square and quickly gained momentum, drawing millions of Egyptians into the streets. As the situation grew increasingly volatile and with growing calls for his resignation from both domestic and international communities, Mubarak attempted to cling to power by promising reforms. However, by February 11th, it became clear that his position was untenable. Mubarak stepped down, transferring power to the military. His resignation marked the end of a 3-decade autocratic rule and was a significant turning point in the Arab Spring. The aftermath of Mubarak's departure saw Egypt enter a period of political instability, with a brief period of Islamist governance under President Mohamed Morsi, followed by a military coup that brought President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi to power. Mubarak's resignation remains a symbol of the power of popular protests and the quest for political reform in the Arab world. These instances of leaders fleeing their nations highlight the tumultuous nature of political crises and transitions. In addition to these, there are several other notable leaders that have also departed under significant duress. Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, was captured in 2003 after the US-led invasion, ending his regime that had lasted over 2 decades. In Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi was detained by the military junta in 2021, marking a severe setback for the country's democratic aspirations. Juan Guaido, the Venezuelan opposition leader, fled the country in 2023 due to escalating threats and pressure from Nicolas Maduro's government. Meanwhile, Kazakhstan's long-serving leader Nursultan Nazarbayev stepped back from the political spotlight amid widespread unrest in early 2022. These are just a few examples among many where leaders are being compelled to leave their positions and countries due to crises of legitimacy, internal strife, or external intervention. Such events reflect broader patterns of political instability and the complex dynamics of leadership transitions in modern history. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed, do let me know by clicking the like button, do share, write a comment, and don't forget to subscribe so you can catch up my next video.